The sun bled low across the rugged hills of Sage Creek, casting long, bruised shadows over the broken land. The dirt road was empty, save for a battered wagon tilted awkwardly at the side. Its axle snapped clean in two. Beside it stood Ellie Thatcher, wiping dust from her brow, jaw set with the stubbornness of someone who had already survived more than her share of storms. She was alone. Her horse had bolted hours ago, spooked by a rattler, and now the chill of the coming night was creeping in fast. In the distance, the mournful cry of coyotes rose, a haunting reminder of how unforgiving this land could be. Then through the thickening dusk, a figure appeared, a lone rider cutting across the prairie like a shadow unbothered by time. He wore a worn hat pulled low, a long duster coat flapping against the lean sides of his horse. No badge, no company, just a slow, deliberate approach, like he had nothing to fear, or had learned fear wasn't worth his time. To Ellie, he looked like just another drifter, but Sage Creek had taught her better than to trust first impressions. She squared her shoulders, braced against the gathering dark, and waited. The man pulled his horse to a stop a few paces away, tipping his hat back just enough for Ellie to catch a glimpse of a face worn by sun and silence. Not old, but seasoned. Eyes like river stones, steady, unreadable. "You look like you could use a hand," he said, his voice low and even. Ellie tightened her grip on the wagon side, the splintered wood rough against her palm. "Depends on whose hand's offering." A ghost of a smile crossed his lips, there and gone. "Name's Robert Calloway," he said. "Not here to cause trouble. Just figured no good comes from being stuck out here after sundown." She hesitated, weighing her options. The broken wagon, the empty horizon, the chill threading through her bones. Finally, she gave a curt nod. "If you know anything about wagon axles, I'm listening." Robert swung down from his horse with easy grace, the kind that said he spent more time in a saddle than in any house with a roof. He walked the wagon slow, inspecting the damage without touching it. When he crouched beside the broken wheel, Ellie caught sight of the revolver holstered at his hip. Worn but clean, the leather molded perfectly to it. "Axle's cracked clean," he said after a moment. "No fixing it here." "Then what?" Ellie asked. He stood, dusting his hands on his jeans. "Got a spare timber at my camp a mile back. Could rig a temp fix. Enough to get you to the next rise where the trail splits." She frowned. "You expect me to ride off with a stranger?" He shrugged, neither offended nor pushy. "You're welcome to sit here and wait for the coyotes. Or worse." Ellie sighed, the tension draining from her like a leaking barrel. "Fine, but I'm riding my own horse." Robert's brow lifted slightly. "You got a horse?" She flushed. "Had." She spooked. He whistled, low and amused. "Then you ride with me, Miss Thatcher," she said tightly. "Ellie Thatcher." "Pleasure," he said, and meant it. Ellie grabbed her rifle from the wagon, slinging it over her shoulder. Robert offered his hand to help her up behind him, and after a brief hesitation, she took it. His palm was calloused, warm, a grounding kind of solid. The horse shifted under their combined weight, but Robert kept it steady with a low word she didn't catch. They rode in silence, the dusk deepening into a velvet black sky pierced by the first pricks of starlight. Ellie kept a wary distance, though it was near impossible on the narrow saddle. She could smell the leather of his coat, the faint trace of sweat and horse, the undeniable scent of someone who belonged to the land as much as it belonged to him. It wasn't long before they crested a rise and reached a small camp tucked between two boulders, a tidy fire pit, a rough lean-to, a second horse picketed nearby, a rangy gray that watched them with mild disinterest. Robert slid off first, then helped her down with the same quiet efficiency. "Fire's still warm," Ellie noted. He nodded. "Left it burning. Figured I'd find trouble one way or another." Ellie shot him a look. "Is that your idea of optimism?" Robert chuckled, a sound as rare and fleeting as rain in Sage Creek. "Just realism." He went to a pack slung beneath the lean-to and dug out a heavy timber wrapped in rough canvas. "Won't be pretty," he said, hauling it onto his shoulder with an ease that made Ellie blink. "But it'll hold long enough." They made the trek back to the wagon under a sky full of stars, the land stretching around them, vast and silent. As they worked by lantern light, Ellie holding the beam steady while Robert hammered and braced. She found herself stealing glances at him. There was a steadiness to him, a surety in every move he made, that spoke louder than words. Not a boy playing cowboy, not a man looking for trouble. Someone used to fixing things others left broken. Someone who'd seen too much to ever call anything easy again. When they finished, the makeshift axle creaked but held. Robert patted the wagon wheel and stepped back. "It'll get you home." Ellie exhaled, feeling a tightness in her chest she hadn't even realized was there. "Thank you." He tipped his hat, gathering his reins. "Just doing what needed doing." As he swung into the saddle, Ellie surprised herself. "You hungry?" she asked. He paused, silhouetted against the star-cloaked sky. "Always," he said with a lopsided grin, and just like that, under the watchful eyes of 1,000 silent stars, a crack opened in the walls Ellie Thatcher had spent a lifetime building. A crack wide enough, maybe, for something new to slip through. The fire crackled low between them, sending up lazy sparks into the velvet black of the Sage Creek night. Ellie ladled out a second helping of stew, thick with beans and rabbit meat, and passed the tin plate across to Robert. He accepted it with a nod, his rough fingers brushing hers for the briefest moment. A flicker of warmth she pretended not to notice. They ate in companionable silence, broken only by the soft clink of cutlery against metal and the occasional pop from the firewood. "You always fix strangers' wagons?" Ellie asked finally, wiping her mouth on her sleeve. Robert shrugged. "Only the ones that look mean enough to shoot me if I don't." A reluctant smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "Smart man." He ate steadily, unhurried, like someone who knew how to stretch a meal for both taste and necessity. Ellie studied him over the rim of her cup. There was something about him that didn't quite fit the mold of the usual drifters who wandered through Sage Creek. He moved too clean, spoke too careful, carried himself like a man who knew exactly how far he could go and how fast he could get there. "Where were you headed?" she asked. He finished chewing, then set his plate aside. "Nowhere in particular. Not much of a plan." He glanced at her, the firelight catching the faintest hint of a smirk. "Sometimes, nowhere's the only place a man needs to be." Ellie snorted softly. That sounds like the kind of thing someone says when they don't want to answer. He didn't deny it, just leaned back against a rock and stretched out his legs, hat tilted low over his brow. The stars spun slowly overhead, cold and sharp as glass. For a while, they let the quiet settle between them. Ellie found it almost comforting. Most men filled the air with talk, trying to impress or intimidate. Robert filled it with his presence, steady and unbothered, as if silence itself was a language he spoke fluently. When the fire had burned low and the night grew colder, Ellie rose and dusted off her trousers. "I've got a bunkhouse you can use," she said, half expecting him to decline. Most men wouldn't turn down an offer of shelter, but they'd grumble about the rules that came with it. Robert simply nodded. "Much obliged." They saddled up and rode the rest of the way back to Silver Ridge Ranch, Ellie's patch of hard-won land at the edge of Sage Creek's reach. The house came into view first, its porch light a flickering glow against the dark. The barn loomed behind it, sturdy but worn, like everything else she owned. As they approached, Ellie spotted movement out near the far fence line. A cow gone loose again, no doubt. She made a mental note to check it in the morning. Robert dismounted with easy grace, tethered his horse, and looked to her for direction. "Bunkhouse is there," she said, nodding toward a small outbuilding to the right of the barn. "Spare cot, water barrel, old stove if you know how to coax it." "I'll manage," he said simply. She hesitated, thumb running absently over the strap of her rifle. "You planning to move on tomorrow?" Robert adjusted his saddle blanket over the rail. "If that's what you want." Ellie chewed the inside of her cheek. She wasn't in the habit of trusting easy, especially not when it came to men who showed up out of the dusk with nothing but a quiet voice and a steady hand. But something about Robert Calloway felt different, dangerous maybe, but not in the way most men were. Not a threat to her safety, a threat to her walls. "I could use help for a few days," she said at last. "Fence is falling apart, barn roof leaks like a sieve, and Dusty, my mare, needs her leg looked after." Robert tipped his hat back, revealing eyes dark and fathomless. Then I'll stay a few days, and he said. Something unspoken passed between them then. Not a promise. Not yet, but something close. Ellie turned toward the house, boots crunching on dry earth. Breakfast at first light. If you're late, you don't eat. He chuckled low behind her. Understood. She didn't turn around as she climbed the porch steps, but she could feel him watching. Not possessive, not invasive. Just steady. Inside, she leaned her rifle against the doorframe and sagged against the wall, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. A few days. That's all she needed. A few days of help, then he'd be on his way, and Sage Creek would slip back into the same lonely rhythm it always had. And yet, as she peered out the window into the dark, where Robert moved like a shadow toward the bunkhouse, she wondered if the land itself wasn't holding its breath too. Waiting. For what, she couldn't say. But something had shifted tonight, and nothing in Sage Creek ever shifted without a storm following close behind. Morning came to Silver Ridge Ranch with a thin mist clinging to the low grasses and a pale sun struggling over the horizon. Ellie was already up, apron tied tight, biscuit dough under her fingernails as she worked the small kitchen stove. The smell of strong coffee and frying bacon filled the air. Comforting, steady. She heard the bunkhouse door creak open before she saw him. Robert crossed the yard with long, deliberate strides, his coat slung over one shoulder, sleeves rolled to the elbow. He moved like a man who knew how to work, not just watch it get done. Coffee's hot, Ellie said without looking up. If you're the kind that takes it black. Black's the only way, Robert replied, voice still rough from sleep. He poured himself a cup and settled opposite her at the small wooden table, setting his hat down beside him. For a few minutes, they ate without speaking. Two people who understood the sacredness of a quiet morning. After a while, Robert broke the silence. You built this place yourself. Ellie nodded, slicing into a biscuit. My father started it, left it to me when he passed. Been trying to keep it breathing ever since. Robert took a slow sip of coffee, studying her with that same unreadable gaze. You're doing more than just keeping it breathing. Ellie shrugged one shoulder. Sometimes it feels like that's all I'm doing. Patch a fence here, mend a roof there, fight off whatever's coming next. His mouth twitched, almost a smile. Life's like that. Maybe for some, she muttered. For others, it feels like life's the one doing the fighting. They finished breakfast, and by first light they were walking the perimeter fence together, assessing the damage. Ellie pointed out posts leaning like old drunkards and strands of rusted wire that barely hung on. Robert listened more than he spoke, nodding here and there, occasionally crouching to examine the ground like he could read its history from the dust. You get much trouble out here? He asked as they walked. Ellie sighed, pushing her hat back with the edge of her wrist. Not until lately. Robert glanced at her sideways. Trouble's got a name? Her jaw tightened. Wade Easton. At the sound of that name, even the birds seemed to fall silent for a beat. Heard of him, Robert said finally. Then you know he doesn't take kindly to people saying no. Robert hooked his thumbs into his belt. And you said no. Every time he comes sniffing around, offering to relieve me of the burden of this land, she said bitterly. Last month, he sent men to lean on me, broke 2 gates, spooked the cattle. Robert's gaze darkened. What did the sheriff do? Ellie barked a humorless laugh. Sheriff's got both hands tied with Easton's coin. Justice only rides one way in Sage Creek. They reached the back corner of the property where the fence dipped dangerously low. Robert tested it with his boot, then crouched down to inspect the posts. We can brace this, he said. Might buy you a season or two. We? She teased, arching a brow. He looked up at her, and for the first time there was no guarded distance in his expression, only something steadier. Something that settled in her chest in a way that was both terrifying and comforting. We, he said simply. Ellie swallowed hard, shoving her hands deep into her pockets to hide the sudden tremor in her fingers. They spent the day hauling wood from the old shed, digging new post holes, and stretching wire under a sun that grew hotter with each passing hour. Robert worked without complaint, his strength quiet but undeniable. More than once, Ellie caught herself stealing glances at him, at the way his shirt clung to the hard lines of his back, at the ease with which he lifted and swung heavy beams. It had been a long time since anyone had shared the weight of this land with her, and she hadn't realized just how heavy it had become. By late afternoon, sweat slicked their brows and their arms ached, but the fence stood firm. Ellie leaned against a post, wiping her sleeve across her forehead. "Not bad for a day's work," she said. Robert set down the hammer, rolling his shoulder with a grimace. "Could use a whiskey the size of a watering trough." Ellie laughed, a real one this time, and Robert looked at her like he hadn't heard laughter in years, like it was something rare and precious. The moment stretched between them, full and fragile, until a low rumble on the road snapped it apart. They both turned as a cloud of dust rose in the distance. A rider coming fast. Ellie's stomach twisted. Robert stepped forward, hand instinctively dropping to the butt of his revolver. The rider pulled up hard near the gate, a young stable boy from town, panting and wide-eyed. "Miss Thatcher," he gasped. "Easton's in town. He's at the saloon, talking big. Says he's coming for your place before the month's out." Ellie felt the blood drain from her face. Robert didn't say a word. He just looked at her. Steady, sure. "What do you want to do?" he asked. Ellie straightened, pulling herself taller against the rising fear clawing at her throat. "We fight," she said, voice low and certain. Robert nodded once, the ghost of a grim smile playing at his mouth. "Then we best get ready." As the boy rode off and the dust settled, the wind picked up again, carrying with it the first whispers of a coming storm. And this time, Ellie knew she wouldn't be standing alone. Not anymore. By the time the sun sank behind the jagged hills of Sage Creek, the town was already humming with trouble. Word traveled faster than wildfire in a place like this, and by the time Ellie and Robert rode in, every eye in the saloon turned to mark their arrival. Robert dismounted first, tying their horses at the hitching post with slow, deliberate movements. Ellie swung down after him, her palms sweaty against the worn leather reins. She hated this, hated stepping into a room already loaded with judgment and whispers. But hate didn't change facts, and facts needed facing. The wooden floorboards of the saloon groaned under their boots as they entered. Smoke hung thick in the air, curling around the low murmur of conversations that died out the moment they crossed the threshold. Wade Easton was easy to spot. He stood at the far end of the bar, a whiskey glass dangling from 2 fingers, leaning in too close to a rancher Ellie recognized. Hank Remy, a man one bad season away from losing his spread. Easton's voice carried, smooth as snake oil. "You can fight the dust, Hank," he was saying, "but you can't fight time. Better to sell now, while you still got something worth trading." The rancher shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting toward Ellie and Robert. Wade turned too, a slow, oily smile spreading across his face when he saw them. "Well, look what the wind blew in," he drawled. "Miss Thatcher and her new hired hand." Robert said nothing, just took up a post near the doorway, arms crossed, every inch of him radiating quiet danger. Ellie stepped forward alone. She wouldn't let Wade think he could scare her back into a corner. Not this time. "You sent men to my ranch," she said, voice low but clear. Wade took a leisurely sip of his whiskey. "You sure about that, darling? Maybe you just had a run of bad luck." The room tensed around them. Even the bartender paused in polishing a glass. Ellie's hands curled into fists at her sides. "You think you can scare me into selling?" "I think," Wade said, setting his glass down with a soft clink, "you're about 2 bad harvests and 1 dry well away from begging me for an offer." He took a step closer, and for a moment, the smell of tobacco and leather filled her nose. "But I'm a generous man," he murmured. "I'll still take that land off your hands, maybe even let you stay on as help." A ripple of ugly laughter ran through the saloon. Robert pushed off from the wall, moving slow but certain. He didn't reach for his gun. He didn't have to. The weight of him filled the room like a storm front rolling in. "You should walk away, Easton," Robert said, his voice a low rumble. "While you still can." Wade turned, sizing him up with a sneer. "And who are you supposed to be? Some washed-up gun hand she picked up out of pity?" Robert's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. You got the washed-up part wrong." The tension stretched taut as a wire between them. One wrong word, one twitch toward a holster, and the saloon would explode. Ellie's heart hammered against her ribs, but she stood her ground. "You won't take my land," she said, loud enough for every man and woman in the room to hear. "You won't scare me off it either." For a long moment, Wade just stared at her. Then he laughed, a slow, mocking sound. "We'll see," he said, grabbing his hat and pushing past them toward the door. But as he passed Robert, he leaned in close, voice low enough only they could hear. "Won't be your fence he comes for next time," he said. "It'll be you." Then he was gone, boots thudding against the dusty boardwalk outside. The saloon slowly exhaled around them, the tension bleeding out as conversations resumed. Softer, warier. Ellie turned to Robert, trying to steady her breathing. "You heard him," she said. "I heard," Robert replied grimly. They left the saloon without another word, mounting up and riding back to Silver Ridge as the night closed in thick and heavy. The stars were sharp above them, cold and uncaring. Ellie kept her gaze forward, her hands tight on the reins. "He's not going to stop," she said after a long while. Robert rode a little closer. "Number, he's not. And if we push back, he'll push harder," Robert said simply. Ellie swallowed hard against the knot of fear rising in her throat. She had fought so long, so hard to keep what was hers. The land, the memories, the life her father had bled for. She couldn't lose it. Not now. Not like this. When they reached the ranch, Robert dismounted and looped his horse's reins loosely over the fence post. Then he turned to her, moonlight catching the hard set of his jaw. "You're not alone in this," he said, quiet but firm. Ellie blinked against the sudden sting in her eyes. She nodded once, quick and sharp, because if she tried to speak, she might break apart. Together, they moved through the darkness, checking the fences, securing the barn doors, loading the rifles with steady hands, preparing. Because Wade Easton was coming, and this time, he wasn't bringing offers. He was bringing war. The next morning dawned cold and brittle, the kind of morning that felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. Ellie stood on the porch of the ranch house, a rifle slung over one shoulder, eyes scanning the horizon. There was no dust trail yet, no sign of Wade Easton's men. But she knew better than to be fooled by silence. Inside, Robert moved through the kitchen, methodically checking supplies. Rifles cleaned, ammunition counted, food packed into saddlebags in case they needed to run or hold out longer than expected. When Ellie stepped inside, he glanced at her but said nothing. Words weren't needed between them now. The air was already thick with everything they weren't saying. "You ready?" she asked quietly. Robert tightened the strap on a saddlebag. "Ready as we'll ever be." They spent the morning fortifying the ranch. Robert rigged tripwires along the back pasture, lines of cowbells strung low between fence posts. Ellie nailed boards across the lower barn windows and checked the hinges on the heavy doors twice over. Every hammer strike echoed across the dry fields like a dare. When the sun climbed high and the heat shimmered off the dirt, they took a break by the well. Robert drew up a bucket of water, handed her a tin cup first. Ellie drank deep, then wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "Do you think they'll come today?" Robert leaned against the well post, eyes narrowed against the sun. "If I were him, I'd wait until nightfall." Ellie nodded. She had expected as much. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, she said, "You don't have to stay." Robert looked at her then, and for the first time since he rode into her life, all the walls were gone. "I do," he said simply. Ellie felt something inside her crack wide open. For so long, she had fought every battle alone, fists up, heart guarded. But Robert Calloway wasn't just standing beside her. He was choosing to fight with her, for her. She set the cup down and crossed the short distance between them. Without hesitation, she laid her hand against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. "You're a stubborn man," she said, voice thick. A corner of his mouth lifted. "Takes one to know one." Before she could lose her nerve, Ellie leaned up and pressed her forehead against his chest. Robert wrapped his arms around her. Slow, careful, like he was afraid she'd shatter if he moved too fast. They stood there a long time, wrapped in the kind of silence that needed no explanation. Later, as the sun sank low and the sky bruised into twilight, they took positions. Robert in the barn loft with a rifle. Ellie on the porch with her father's old Winchester laid across her lap. Waiting. Watching. The first sign came just after dark. The faint rumble of hooves against hard ground. Then the distant flicker of lanterns bobbing like will-o'-the-wisps across the far hills. Easton wasn't coming quietly. Robert slid down from the loft and crossed to her. "They'll expect you to surrender." "I won't," Ellie said. He nodded like he never doubted her. "Then we hold until help comes." She gave him a grim smile. "Sheriff won't come. He's bought and paid for." Robert's jaw tightened. "Then we hold for ourselves." The minutes stretched painfully slow. Ellie's grip tightened on the rifle, knuckles white. She could see them now. Easton's men, riding hard, dust clouds rising behind them. 5 riders, maybe 6. Not a full army, but enough. Enough to burn the ranch to the ground if they wanted to. Robert stood by her side, calm as stone, eyes tracking every movement, with that same unshakable focus she had come to trust. As the riders closed in, Ellie felt her heart hammer against her ribs, but she didn't move. She didn't run. She planted her boots on her porch, her father's porch, and squared her shoulders. This land was hers. Her family's blood soaked the roots of every tree, the dust of every trail, and she'd be damned if she gave it up without a fight. Easton rode at the front, a black scarf covering the lower half of his face. Coward. He pulled up hard just beyond the fence line, raising a hand to signal his men to fan out. Robert muttered low beside her. "Looks like they want to scare you first." "Let 'em try," Ellie said, lifting her rifle to her shoulder. The standoff stretched long and thin, the only sound the whimpering wind and the restless stomp of horses. Then Easton called out across the darkening yard, "Last chance, Thatcher. Sign the papers and walk away." Ellie stepped forward, raising her voice so it carried over the brittle silence. "You want this land, Easton?" She chambered around with a sharp, echoing snap. "Come and take it." For a moment, everything stood still. The horses snorted and pawed at the earth, riders shifting nervously in their saddles. The last of the sun's light bled from the sky, leaving only a bruised twilight stretching over Sage Creek. The barrel of Ellie's rifle gleamed in the half-dark. Then Easton laughed. It was an ugly sound, sharp and humorless. "You got guts, Thatcher," he called out. "I'll give you that." He flicked his hand. 2 of his men kicked their horses forward, galloping toward the porch. Ellie didn't hesitate. She squeezed the trigger, the rifle kicking against her shoulder. The lead rider's hat flew off and his horse reared, nearly throwing him. The second man jerked hard to the left, spooked, losing control. From the loft, Robert fired in one clean, precise shot. A bullet split the air, striking the dirt right in front of the second horse, sending both rider and mount sprawling. The porch shook under Ellie's boots from the force of the rifle's recoil, but she held steady, heart pounding in her ears. "Fall back," Easton bellowed, yanking his horse into a tight turn. But it was too late for neat retreats. The men panicked, scattering under the sudden, unexpected resistance. One rider crashed into a fence post, another threw down his weapon and fled into the darkness. Robert climbed down from the loft, moving like a shadow. He kept his rifle aimed low but ready, covering Ellie's side without a word needed between them. Easton sat his horse, rage burning in his eyes. "This isn't over," he shouted. Ellie stepped forward, lowering her rifle just enough for him to see the fire still burning in her. "It is for you," she said. For a long moment, Easton just sat there, seething. Then he spat into the dirt, yanked his reins hard, and galloped away into the dark, what was left of his men scrambling after him. Silence fell. Heavy, final. Ellie lowered her rifle, chest heaving. Robert crossed to her, taking the gun gently from her hands and setting it aside. "You did it," he said. "No," she whispered, voice thick. "We did." The adrenaline drained out of her all at once, leaving her legs weak. Robert caught her before she stumbled, steadying her with hands that were bruised but sure. For the first time in years, Ellie Thatcher let herself lean on someone else. And for the first time, Someone didn't let her fall. The next few days passed in a haze of exhaustion and cautious hope. The sheriff came by, grumbling but making it clear that, with Easton exposed and several witnesses willing to talk, the land grab was over, at least for now. Robert stayed. He patched the broken fences, helped repair the porch rail Easton's men had splintered, mended the barn roof they had riddled with bullets. He stayed through every sunrise and every quiet supper, through every rebuilding, every scar that needed stitching, every hollow silence that needed filling. He stayed. One evening, as Ellie stood by the corral watching Dusty graze under the wide purple sky, Robert joined her. "You ever think about selling after all this?" he asked quietly. Ellie shook her head. "This land, it's more than dirt and wood and water. It's memory. It's blood. It's home." Robert nodded, silent for a long time. Then he pulled something from his pocket. A simple silver band. No jewels, no grand flourish. Just solid, worn a little at the edges, like something that had waited a long time for the right hand. "I don't have much left to give," he said, voice rougher than usual. "No fortune, no big name, just this place and myself." Ellie blinked, her throat closing tight. Robert cleared his throat, looking almost shy for the first time. "But if you'll have it, if you'll have me, I'd like to stay for good." Ellie didn't answer with words. She took the ring from his hand, slipped it onto her finger, where it fit as if it had been made for her, and then rose onto her toes to kiss him. Soft where sure, the kiss of two people who had bled and fought and stayed. When they finally pulled apart, Ellie smiled up at him. "Home's not a place, Robert," she said. "It's who you come back to." Years later, the ranch stood stronger than ever. New fences, new horses, new life. Children ran through the fields. The barn echoed with laughter and music during long summer nights. And at the edge of it all stood a sign, hand-carved and weathered by the years. Silver Ridge Ranch, where hearts find their way home. Sometimes visitors would ask Ellie and Robert how it all began, how they had built something so lasting from a land so harsh. They would just smile and say, "One stubborn step at a time." Because in the end, it wasn't the land that saved them. It was the stubbornness. It was the fight. It was the choice, made again and again, to stay together, always.